Greetings, everyone. I hope you're faring well in these difficult times. My name is Finian Garrity, and I'm on the Faculty of South Asian Studies here at Brown University. And on behalf of the Center for Contemporary South Asia and the Watson Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this installment of our weekly South Asia seminar. And I'd encourage you to join our mailing list so that we can keep you in the loop about future events. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome the historian and activist, Audrey Truschke, who will be speaking to us about the intersection of Hindu nationalist politics and the historiography of India. Dr. Truschke is currently Associate Professor of South Asian History at Rutgers University. She is the award-winning author of numerous books and articles. These include her 2017 monograph, Aurangzeb, The Life and Legacy of India's Most Controversial King, from Stanford University Press, and her latest monograph from Columbia University Press, which has just come out, The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule. In addition to being a distinguished historian, Professor Truschke is also an activist, and her scholarship very much informs her activism. Today, she'll be giving a talk entitled Hindutva History and Other Modern Problems with the Indian Past. Welcome, Audrey. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Finian, for that kind introduction. And thanks to everyone at Brown for hosting me and enabling this event. And a warm welcome to everyone taking time out of your Friday afternoon, evening, possibly morning. Right? Zoom has many wonders in regards to time to join me and think a little bit about Hindutva history and other sort of strange things. So I want to speak with you all today about some Hindutva problems with the Indian past and Indian history. And let me just sort of begin with a kind of spoiler alert, which is that there are a lot of Hindutva problems with South Asian history. In fact, it's really quite toxic how Hindutva ideologues or Hindu nationalists use and abuse South Asian history. What I want to do today is to add, I hope, quite a bit of depth and nuance to that very broad generalization. I also hope to convince you about the roles that historians can and do play in this very modern set of debates, as well as the pushback that some of us endure for doing so. So it seems to me the first thing that I want to do is to define Hindutva. And this is going to be old news to a lot of you, but perhaps it still helps for context to sort of see this through my eyes. So Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva, and I do use those as synonyms, is a form of ethno-nationalism. It advocates for the supremacy of Hindus in modern day India, represented by the sort of saffron-drenched map here. Now, Hindutva ideology is currently, I would say, the dominant ideology in modern India. That term Hindutva, it's supposed to look like Sanskrit, okay? And thus lend Hindu nationalism this sense of kind of age and gravitas. But this is false, okay? Hindutva is what I would call phony Sanskrit. And thus already we have our first example of Hindutva's problems, in this case with invented history of a linguistic nature. So the word Hindutva has two components. Many of you know this, Hindu and Tva. Hindu is not a Sanskrit word, not originally. It's a Persian term. It was coined about 1,000 years ago. And for the vast majority of the past millennium, it has been used by non-Hindus to refer to residents of the Indian subcontinent. So its specifically religious sense, especially an exclusive religious sense, is a much newer thing. Now that suffix tva, that actually is Sanskrit. It means ness, N-E-S-S. So Hindutva is Hindu-ness or perhaps Indian-ness. That term Hindutva, it was coined about 100 years ago. And indeed, this ideology is about 100 years old. It is an unmistakable creation of the early 20th century when ethno-nationalism swept through parts of Europe. The most prominent articulator of Hindutva ideology in its early days was V.D. Savarkar. And you can see a sort of garlanded picture of him here being honored by India's current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. Today, Hindutva is openly advocated by a range of political, cultural, and paramilitary groups in India, and to some degree among the Indian diaspora as well. Hindutva has a whole mess of problems as an ideology. It's narrow, it is openly prejudiced, it's intolerant of religious minorities, and it tends to provoke violence. Perhaps its Achilles heel is its reliance on a mythologized past. To put it very bluntly, Hindutva ideologues base many of their modern claims on a history that is imagined and outlandish to a startling degree. And this is where a historian like me comes into the picture. So if you were starting to wonder why, in fact, you are taking time out of your busy day to listen to a pre-modern historian talk about a modern problem, I want to address that explicitly. Today, as I name, analyze, and contextualize some Hindutva problems with history, I want to explore and demonstrate precisely what a pre-modern historian might say and bring to this decidedly modern set of political disputes. And as it so happens, I think we actually have a lot to contribute to this particular subject. And I want to stress here that it really is a key point that I am trained as a pre-modern historian. I'm trained as both a Sanskritist and a Persianist. Even now, I spend most of my time working on the late 12th to the early 18th centuries, reading manuscripts like the one you see on the screen in front of you. Now, I have my share of detractors, people that think that someone trained to read old Sanskrit texts and work on the Mughal Empire should just keep her nose out of modern politics. That is a view that is fairly prevalent outside of the academy, but it's not unheard of within the academy either. There are two core reasons why I have begun working and publishing on Hindutva in addition, and sometimes in conjunction with my pre-modern focused research. The first is that proponents of this hateful ideology just won't leave me alone. I get hate mail every single day. I have for slightly over 5 years now. And so because Hindu nationalists have made themselves part of my life and my lived experience on this earth, well, what else is a scholar to do except analyze what people throw at you, right? And this is a traditional academic's response. Give me anything and I will analyze it for you. Second, and perhaps more convincing as to why you should listen to me, is that the particularities of Hindutva thought actually make a pre-modern historian quite well positioned to comment on certain aspects of this ideology. That being, of course, part of the reason, a big part of the reason why Hindutva ideologues go after me so relentlessly, is I actually do have a lot to say about this. So now that we've established, broadly speaking, what we're talking about and why I am here to talk about it, let's begin. And what I want to do is go through a number of examples. And I want to draw your attention to some of the specifics as well as some of the more general overarching features in terms of how Hindu nationalist thought and Hindutva ideology address and theorize and deal with the past. So let me begin with origins. That's always a good place to start. Hindutva ideologues are very invested in claiming indigeneity and specifically claiming that Hindus are indigenous to India. Okay, this is a big thing with them. And that is because the Hindutva argument for Hindu supremacy in the modern day rests in part on this idea that Hindus are the original Indians. So they have a sort of claim of longevity on the subcontinent that no other group can rival. Now, many scholars, myself included, would certainly not contest as a basic generalization the following statement: Hinduism is from India. That strikes me as generally unobjectionable, but Hindutva ideologues sort of back themselves into a corner on this point because of two specific ideas that they hold. The first is this, that Hindus must be from the subcontinent always. All right, and many Hindutva ideologues stress this again and again, that there is no point in the past at which Hindus were not from India. The second sort of precept that they have is that Hindu culture never changes at its core, that the soul of Hinduism, which for them is the same as the soul of India, that this is constant over time. Now, I want to stress that this is an outright dismissal of the very basis of historical inquiry, right? When we tell elementary school students what historians study, we say that we study change over time, right? That's the most basic way to put what historians do. But Hindutva thinkers and ideologues, they deny such change regarding Hindu culture in particular. Now, this divergent set of views on change over time is part of why, for example, I and many other historians decline to ever directly debate with those who espouse Hindutva ideology. There's simply nothing to talk about because they deny a critical foundation of inquiry within the humanities overall, namely that stuff changes and so there are things to study. But the combination of these two ideas, okay, a preoccupation with Hindus being indigenous to India and a denial of change, even over millennia, this results in a very odd understanding of temporality. And one sort of upshot is this, that a threat anytime is a threat now from the perspective of Hindutva thought. Even events that occurred thousands of years ago might be viscerally threatening to Hindutva ideologues today. For the rest of us, a specific event may be so far in the past that no one remembers or cares, except historians, of course, because we always remember and always care. But Hindutva ideologues really think about this quite differently, and they open themselves up to powerful criticism by embracing the whole past as immediately relevant to our present. This is something best seen through an example, and I'll give you two of them. The first is the Aryan migration theory. Now, many of you will be familiar with this. Okay, this is a theory that scholars developed largely in the 19th century, right? 18th into the 19th centuries. And the theory is that bands of Indo-European speakers migrated from somewhere further west, maybe the Caucasus, maybe Persia, maybe both, okay, but somewhere further west, around 3,500 years ago, over a couple of hundred years into northwestern parts of the subcontinent. The initial migrations took a few hundred years, most likely. It took several hundred more years before these Indo-European speakers got to the Gangetic plain, and longer still before they spread to the rest of the subcontinent. Now, these Indo-European speakers, who referred to themselves as the Aryans or the Aryas, developed Vedic Sanskrit. They composed and they preserved the Vedas, our oldest extant Indian texts. This theory is backed by nearly ironclad linguistic evidence. Linguistic evidence is very strong, even as the precise details remain, and frankly, will probably always remain murky. Now, in the context of Hindutva, a question arises with the Aryan migration theory, which is this. Does it mean that Hindus aren't indigenous to India? Since the ancestors of at least many of the people who composed the Vedas came from outside of the subcontinent, does this somehow mean that Hinduism has foreign origins? Now, scholars, generally speaking, would not pose the question this way, okay? But if asked it, I think our overarching answer, at least my overarching answer, would be, of course not. That's ridiculous, okay? There are a whole lot of issues here. Do we think Vedic culture was really Hinduism? Like modern Hinduism and Vedic culture 3,000 years ago are pretty darn different. In any case, Vedic sort of traditions, including the very language of the Rig Veda, the oldest extant Vedic text, changed once the Indo-European speakers got to the northwestern subcontinent. So the entire tradition is inconceivable without cross-cultural fertilization between migrating groups and people already on the subcontinent. There's also, of course, the pesky question of just how long do you have to be somewhere? And how much does your culture have to change before your new home is home? I'm going to decline to give a number of years in answer to that question, but I think that 3,000 years is long enough by a real generous margin. Of course, by that same logic, we would also need to admit, as fully Indian, members of other religions, such as Christians and Muslims. Followers of Hindutva tend to be fairly opposed to that. But consider this question from the perspective of Hindutva ideologues. Does the Aryan migration theory mean that Hindus aren't indigenous to India? Well, for them, it kind of does. Okay, and it's a real problem for Hindu nationalists. And so they respond with silence, right, just sort of ignoring it, or with yelling. And the bad tactics of Hindutva ideologues is a subject to which I will return a couple of times in this talk. Hindutva ideologues today generally deny the Aryan migration theory. Okay, they deny real, grounded, factually based history, but they also do something else. Right? After they deny the sort of real story, Hindu nationalists thus free themselves up to spin their own narrative. Right? So they not only deny real history, but they create their own fiction. And their fiction stipulates that Hindus have somehow always been in India. Let me give you one more example of sort of old ideas and old things being really threatening to Hindu nationalists today. And this further enhances the temporality point, and it also allows me to say something about Hindutva tactics against scholars. So let me give you the sort of standard scholars' history on cows and beef eating. So the Vedic peoples, those Indo-European speakers we were talking about, they sacrificed and ate animals, including cattle. This is, say, 1000 BCE, so a long time ago. Quite a bit later, in the early century CE, an idea arose that upper caste Hindus should not consume beef. Now, there remains variety on this point, even today, but overall, not eating beef has become a marker of a certain kind of Hindu identity for many. Historically, this is all fine, right? There's no historical problem here, but Hindutva ideologues see this differently. Changing practices regarding cattle are a huge threat for them. And so when Dian Jha came out with his book, The Myth of the Holy Cow, back in 2002, this was a big problem from the perspective of Hindu nationalists. It's just a whole lot easier to deny history and to make up your own mythology of the past when pesky historians aren't around getting in your way. So when Dian Jha's book came out, it caused a big uproar. It was banned. It was burned. Right? Never a good look when people start burning books. Dian Jha was a model historian. He never budged, although he did need armed security for quite a while, and he faced hate for the rest of his life. And he died just recently in early 2021. Hating on scholars and trying to intimidate us remains a favorite tactic of the Hindu right, but it's not their only tactic. Okay, and I am going to return to the hating on scholars bit, but first I want to focus on the sort of Hindutva tactic of rewriting the past. All right, and I want to give you some of the more eye-catching examples of this. So one of the Hindutva myths about pre-modern India is that it was somehow unified, right? It was somehow united. All students of history know that this is untrue, but Hindu nationalists are very attached to this idea. And the Hindu nationalist interest in having a unified India comes out in both general and specific ways. So let me start with the specific claims, like that there was ever a Rajput empire. Now, I'm taking this map of the Rajput Empire from a satirical website, Mad Mughal Memes, which if you didn't know about them, now you do. You're welcome. All right, but people actually really did try to say this. A Rajasthan University textbook, a book that was actually taught to students at the university level, changed the outcome of a fairly important battle in the late 16th century. In the real world, the Mughals won, and in this history book's fantasy world, the Rajputs won. Now, this may sound very silly, like just changing the outcome of a battle. All right. And it was portrayed as such in the news at the time. And this happened back in 2017, 2018. That said, I still face questions from students and others about this particular battle of Haldi Ghati today, and it stems from this controversy. More generally and more pervasive is the assumption of Akhand Bharat, undivided India. And this serves as something that Hindutva ideologues say existed in the past and something that they want to bring back and recover in the future. As a matter of history, it's ludicrous. Akhand Bharat never existed politically, culturally, religiously, or any other way that I can think of. Also, note its erasure. Some might look at that orange saffron map and see unity and power. All I see is who is missing, especially the erasure of India's Muslim population. Now I notice I've been saying the word India and Indian, those terms a lot. Right? Let me say something about this, because a lot of people today prefer not to use them for pre-modern history. Right? Consider your institute's title, right? I'm speaking at the Center for Contemporary South Asia, right? Not India. When we have a modern focus, right, and we're talking about the contemporary world, South Asia makes the most sense, right? It allows us to refer to the entire region rather than the modern Indian nation state. But for pre-modernity, South Asia is anachronistic. That's not a de facto reason not to use it, but it is a reason to give it a little bit more thought. There are a whole lot of terms for the Indian subcontinent in different languages and textual traditions over time. You can see some of them in my word map here. But I like India. I like it. It's used both over time internally and externally. It's also widely intelligible, right? A whole lot of people don't know what you're talking about when you say South Asia. Most people have a better sense of India. The term also allows us to push back in a couple of different ways. So first is that the modern nation state of India is, from a historian's perspective, really new, right? It's not even a century old. I don't see a reason to change how people have used India for about 2,000 years because of such a recent development. And in fact, keeping older, non-contemporary, non-nation state uses of India and Indian alive, well, maybe it'll help us to see our own historical specificity and sort of contingency. Moreover, Hindutva thought seeks to collapse Hindu and Indian into a single identity that is then narrowly tied to an ethno-nationalist state. In short, they're trying to redefine India and Indian. And I want to push back against that because it misunderstands the Indian past and the Indian present. So why not begin with vocabulary? In short, there is an argument for a more historically minded use of India and Indian rather than always in all situations limiting those terms to the modern nation state and thus ceding ground to a specific political ideology. In any case, enough of vocabulary. Right? Back to Hindutva history. So one curious thing about Hindutva visions of the past is a sort of obsession, and I think obsession is a fair word, with equality with the modern West, especially in scientific terms. Many of you will be familiar with some of these outrageous claims of finding modern science in ancient India. So back in 2014, at that point, India's new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, said that genetic science existed in ancient times as well as reproductive genetics, citing the example of the sort of demigod Karna and Hindu god Ganesha. Something that came up in 2018 was that a BJP politician claimed that ancient Hindus invented the internet. If you can read the subtitle here, it said on this article, it says, then the Indian internet laughed at him. I must confess, that was a glorious day or two. I was among those who had an absolute field day with that particular claim. But it's not always so funny, okay? Because partially because people actually do believe this stuff, and also, especially it's not funny to me, when such outlandish ideas supplant academic ones. And you see that in the second headline here, that Indians invented planes 7,000 years ago. That was not just a claim that was spouted by somebody on Twitter, right? This was something that was presented at the Indian Science Congress, which is a scholarly body and one with quite an illustrious history. People have gone so far as to create fairly elaborate schematics of rockets and sort of planes and other amazing kind of flying devices. And they claim that they have gotten these out of the texts of the Vedas, our oldest Hindu text that I mentioned. Now, I'll grant you the Vedas are a little difficult, not a little, they're really difficult to read and understand at times. Okay, they're very esoteric, but I'm quite certain that this stuff isn't in them. But I'm not bringing these examples up to poke fun at them. I'm bringing them up to point out the sort of scramble for sort of equalness with the modern West in scientific terms. And underlying that, I think, is a deep shame on the part of Hindu nationalists in their own heritage, right? And specifically in the sort of unabashed pre-modernity of pre-modern India, as if it really could be any different. And so here, this isn't taking pride in one's past, it's covering it up, even as that cover may be paper thin. Now, speaking of the West, right, and Western thinkers, Hindutva ideologues have adopted other things from them as well. All right, and a good example is the division of South Asian history or Indian history into Hindu and Muslim periods. This was an idea that arose with the Orientalists and British colonialism, and that history is quite well known. So it's a much criticized aspect, of course, of colonial historiography. So I won't belabor that point with you. Let me just underscore a couple of things. One is that Hindutva ideologues have adopted this wholesale, right? They talk about Hindu history and Muslim history all the time. In so doing, they reduce Indians and the long diverse range of South Asian history to modern religious identities. Within the sort of rhetoric of Hindu nationalism, I think the most common way that this division comes out is in terms of idolizing an imagined era of sort of golden Hindu age, followed by then demonizing hundreds of years of oppression as they see it under Muslim-led rule. So this is basically, it's a two-pronged attack, okay? The idolizing of, quote, Hindu history and the demonizing of, quote, Muslim history. But there's problems, okay? And one immediate problem is this. There are a lot of physical and cultural remnants of Indo-Persian or Indo-Muslim rule across the Indian subcontinent, okay? In a city like Delhi, you can't walk very far without coming across something that was built by the Mughals or the Delhi Sultanate, all right? So this stuff, it's there, it's big often, and it's very visible. Delhi's Red Fort is a great example, okay? It's huge, it's a big landmark in Delhi. The bulk of it's associated with Shah Jahan, the fifth Mughal king. And Indian prime ministers over the last 70 plus years have often given speeches in front of it. So here you see Prime Minister Modi, right, giving his Independence Day speech in 2019. He is standing in front of a symbol of Mughal sovereignty, which of course has now been co-opted as a symbol of the sovereignty of the modern Indian nation state. As Modi spoke that day, as happens basically every time Modi speaks, there were other traces of Indo-Persian rule in his very speech, because like all Hindi speakers, he uses Persian vocabulary. On that day in 2019, for example, he spoke of Azad, of freedom, and he spoke of Hindustan, right, a Persian term for India. Now, Modi does this and is also willing to speak in front of the Red Fort, perhaps because he has no other choice. You can only fight your culture so far. But in other cases where there has been more of a perceived option to push back, Hindu nationalists have gone pretty far in trying to supplant what they see as, quote, Muslim parts of India's history. Let me give you a couple of examples, and I'm going to focus here on the sort of built and named landscape. So I think my favorite, both my favorite and my least favorite, sort of depending on your perspective, is the Taj Mahal, also built by Shah Jahan. Now, in Hindu nationalist rhetoric, this magnificent building is sometimes not called the Taj Mahal. It's called Tejo Mahalaya and is posited to be a Hindu temple to Shiva that historians like me have sort of twisted and wrongly and maliciously made into being a Muslim too. Like so much else we've seen, Tejo Mahalaya is laughable, except that so many believe it. And so I want to really at this point pose this question. Why embrace a theory that will expose you to ridicule? Hindutva ideologues do this again and again, as we've seen. Why do that? In this case, part of the answer is that the alternative is so much worse. The alternative to Tejo Mahalaya is to admit that the Mughals and maybe even other Indo-Persian rulers built things of grand artistic achievement and beauty that for people across the world today are emblematic of India. Now, that's not the only storyline about the Mughals, obviously. That should be obvious, but I feel compelled these days to state that. Historians can and do admit complexity, right? We revel in it, really. Historians love complexity. The Mughals, for example, were land-hungry emperors. They conquered. They were also patrons of the arts. But Hindutva ideologues, they don't like admitting complexity. They want to advocate a stark and entirely negative assessment of people like the Mughals, because they want to say that Muslims can never bring anything good to India in either the past or the present. Another example that I think is noteworthy because of what it was renamed is Mughal Sarai Junction, okay, which is a sort of busy railway junction in northern India. And it was renamed a couple of years ago, right, presumably because the word Mughal was in the old title. It was renamed as Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Junction, okay, after a Hindutva ideologue. So here we see a supplanting of sort of Indo-Persian history with specifically Hindutva thinkers. Allahabad was renamed in late 2018. Okay, and within a few weeks after the renaming, even Google Maps complied, and Allahabad began its transition into oblivion, replaced by Prayag Raj. Now, there is a wider context here. Most of you will know it, which is that India has renamed many of its cities over the last several decades. So Bombay is now Mumbai, Madras is Chennai, Bangalore is now Bengaluru, etc. The pattern there, whatever you think of those renamings, there is a clear pattern, which is replacing a colonial era anglicized name with one more appropriate, at least it sounds more appropriate in sort of local Indian languages. But the renaming of Allahabad breaks that mold, because Allahabad is not a colonial era name and it's not anglicized. It dates back about 400 years to when the Mughal Empire controlled much of northern India. So Allahabad is sometimes called Allahabad, but either way, it's a Perso-Arabic name. It's easily recognizable as such in Hindi and Urdu. Okay, it means the city of God. Now the town had an older name. It was called Prayaga, Prayag in vernacular pronunciation, which means confluence, refers to the confluence of holy rivers there. If you're wondering, though, where the Raj part comes from, right? Because it wasn't renamed Prayag, it was renamed Prayag Raj, okay? This Prayag Raj means king of confluences, okay? It's like the bigger, better version, I guess, of Prayag. So what the government of Uttar Pradesh, where this place is located, did then is to replace a Perso-Arabic Muslim-sounding name with a sort of pseudo-Sanskrit Hindu-sounding one on steroids, right? Prayag Raj. Now, this is the second time I've had occasion to mention Hindutva problems with Sanskrit. They like stuff that sounds like Sanskrit, but whether it's actually real Sanskrit, that's not a big concern to them. All right, and there's a wider context here, which is that Hindu nationalists, they claim to love Sanskrit, but so often they actually hate Sanskritists. So they claim to love the language, but if you are actually someone trained to read text written in that language, God help you. How do we square that circle? So basically, as I see it, Hindutva ideologues like what they think Sanskrit can represent in modernity. And they think it can be, sort of following Savarkar and others, this sort of cultural unifier. And that works regardless of whether anyone can read anything written in the language. And arguably it works better if people are ignorant of pre-modern Sanskrit text and their huge variety of views. Right? Hindu nationalism does not pride diversity or sort of different views, right? They want a single unifier. In contrast, the kind of vast array of pre-modern Sanskrit texts and the contents of those materials, that can only be a threat to Hindu nationalism. There's no extra value it can add, but it can pose a problem. Even the Hindu nationalists pour resources sometimes into training elementary and secondary school children in learning Sanskrit, but that doesn't seem to translate into any ability to actually read Sanskrit text. And for those that do work on pre-modern Sanskrit materials, from a Hindu nationalist perspective, they should have the right religion and the right identity. And if you don't, well, then we have problems. And I'll give you the example that came up in late 2019 of Feroz Khan, okay, who was appointed assistant professor of Sanskrit literature in Benares. When he was appointed, Hindu nationalist student groups were upset and they protested his appointment, and this grew to a sort of nationwide issue in India. One thing that I think is really interesting and telling about this episode is the defense that Feroz Khan gave of himself. His defense that was most cited in news articles at the time was not that he knew Sanskrit well, not that he had great training, all of which was true, but that he sang bhajans at home. Right? So it's basically trying to indicate some sort of Hindu-friendly practice. From an academic perspective, that's really neither here nor there, right? His private religious activities do not concern me. Rather, what should matter, of course, is how well he knows the subject over which he wants to teach. At the end of the day, he was not appointed assistant professor of Sanskrit literature. And in that, I think we see just one example of the terrible consequences of Hindutva in the present day, namely a supplanting of Indian Muslims. Now, I've given you enough examples by now, I think, for you to see some of the utter weaknesses and yet the significant dangers of Hindutva claims regarding the Indian past, right, along with some of its key contours. Hindutva history as a phrase, it's an oxymoron since they deny historical change, and it's also an oxymoron because they don't want to know what actually happened. So maybe then it really is not surprising that Hindu nationalists fear historians and other academics. But refuting us is problematic for reasons that I've already discussed, right? And essentially it's risky because we stand on historical arguments, whereas they stand on myth, right? That's not a strong starting position for them. It's easier to intimidate and censor academics, right? And they are willing to use those tactics, whereas scholars are not, and so they have the upper hand on that. And so I want to now turn to that and maybe just talk about it for 10 minutes or so and sort of what it looks like. So I'm going to start with the hate mail, and I warn everyone that this next slide is a bit startling. Receiving hate mail on social media, via email, via snail mail, phone calls, petitions, etc. These are relatively common experiences, especially among female academics. I'm going to draw from my own personal experience here because it is unfortunately extensive. So I've been receiving hate mail for about 5 years, and this is represented by the dates on some of these tweets. I tried to pick a range. And they exemplify some of the major contours of the hate that I get. Misogynist, anti-Semitic, threatening violence, attacking members of my family. On the bottom tweet, At the date at which it was tweeted, I have 2 daughters, and at the date at which it was tweeted, they were ages 3 and 1. There is nothing scholarly here, and I trust that that's apparent. Rather, what the people who are issuing these sort of hateful messages are doing, they're drawing from wells of prejudice, some of which also exist within the academy, and especially misogyny. There are intersections there. So what do we do with this? Let me make a couple of points. One is just to sort of call attention to the fact that this stuff works to intimidate, right? It dissuades other people, especially women, from doing public-facing work. Because really, who wants their mother to read this? My mother's on Twitter. She sees this stuff. Who wants their children to read this? I'm only a couple of years away from having to start talking to my children about this because they're going to see it on social media. Another issue is that this sort of hate can and does sort of spill out into the real world, right? It's not just on social media. I can't just get off Twitter and make this stuff go away. Okay, there are threats of violence that I am sort of compelled to take seriously. I've had to file police reports. I've had to not travel at certain points in time. And I've had to have armed security when I speak, both in India and in the United States. Now, this stuff is met with silence by a whole lot of my colleagues. Many of them, not all, but many of them just don't think it's worth standing up for me. Some of them even think that I deserve it. And if you want to know if you're in that category, think about if you have ever said something like the following. I don't agree with the hate that Audrey gets, but whatever comes after that but, that is something about how I essentially deserve it and did something to bring it on myself. Now, the last point I'll make on this is that this hate mail is very serious. Okay, and that's why I raise it. I don't do it for shock value. Okay, it's very serious. It's a threat to women in the academy because it intimidates, because it spills over into real life violence, and because it places an unfair burden on female scholars. And so, for my colleagues listening who have graduate students, if you are not speaking to your graduate students, both men and women, about this sort of stuff, you are doing them a grave disservice. Okay, and I urge you to rethink your policy on that. Now, the hate mail is hard, but trust me, it's not the only way that Hindutva followers try to silence academics. All right, censorship. That is a Hindu nationalist favorite. Many of you know that the modern Indian nation state has an array of legal and extra-legal tools to both demand and enforce censorship on multiple levels. This takes place through sort of kind of social media fueled outrage, right? Canceled talks, things like that. Pressure on social media companies is one that's been accelerating in the last roughly 6 months, I would say. The most recent is indicated by this headline at the bottom. This was a brouhaha last month where the Indian state attempted to limit online talks in India, basically demanding pre-clearance for them, any online academic talk. Now, the Indian government did walk back this policy, but I think we all stand warned. I doubt that's the last we're going to hear about it. Now, I have written and spoken elsewhere about laws that restrict freedom of speech that are used to prompt both publishers and authors to sort of self-censor their books. I've published 3 books now, right, and they all exist in both US editions and Indian editions. And for each of them, the Indian edition is slightly different because it had to undergo a legal read. And every time the attorney who read it had recommended changes in order to protect both me and my Indian publishers. And these were changes that were recommended to protect both of us from both legal objections and also extra legal violence. Now, when you sort of censor history for a huge audience, you don't change the past. Obviously, the past cannot be changed, but you can and you do change what people can know about it. All right, and sort of prime them for future misinformation. And I'm not going to go through a sort of long list of examples of changes in my books, but I thought I'd just give you the most recent example because it also comments on the sort of increasing Hindutva interest and attention to trying to prevent criticism of their ideology in particular. And this has to do with my most recent book, published in January of 2021, The Language of History. The vast majority of the book is the same. So for those of you who have bought the Indian edition, it's fine. Don't bother to go buy the US edition. It's substantively the same. But the opening sentence is different. In the US edition, as I originally wrote it, it reads, in August 2018, Hindutva extremists prevented me from delivering an academic lecture on pre-modern Indian history in Hyderabad in southern India. In the Indian edition, I was told under legal advice that I could not use Hindutva, right? Like this was too critical of that ideology. And so we had to substitute in violent nationalists. Now, I've been talking quite a bit about pressure on academics, whether they're outside or inside of India. But let me just say a couple of things about Hindutva pressure on both professors and students as well inside of the modern Indian nation state. And I think it's important to call attention to this because, of course, the Indian government has far more power over those who live and work within their boundaries. So there's been a lot of pressure on the Indian Academy. These includes funding cuts, slashing library budgets, reducing PhD admissions, and even the supplanting of academics with ideologues. I think the most striking to me and to many of us remains the violence enacted against students at JNU, at Aligarh Muslim University, and at Jamia in December of 2019 in response to protest against the Citizenship Amendment Act, an openly discriminatory bill. Now there's a question here, which is, how are we as scholars supposed to answer violence? And at least for me, as a scholar, I do it with words, with analysis, with arguments, however ill-matched those might be to violence. And in fact, a whole lot of things about academics and Hindutva ideologues are mismatched, right? Our tactics, our approaches, so on and so forth. Just as our modern tools of choice differ drastically for sort of dealing with disagreement, academic arguments versus violence, so too do our approaches to history and the past. And one sort of last thing that I want to call your attention to regarding Hindutva approaches to history is this, that history is in your blood, right? And this is a quote from Savarkar, this early Hindutva ideologue I mentioned. Does not the blood in your veins, O brother of our common forefathers, cry aloud with recollections of the dear old scenes and ties from which they were so cruelly snatched at the point of the sword? There's many things to say about this quote, but I want to draw attention to the idea that history somehow courses through you in this sort of hot form that keeps you alive, right? It fires you up. It is emotive. For historians, at least for me, this is very uncomfortable. Okay, history is not in my blood, and it doesn't sort of fire me up in that way. I mean, I'm like super excited about South Asian history, right? Like I get really into it. My students kind of make fun of me for that sometimes. Okay, but even that, like it's pretty calm. History is sort of a cool-headed discipline, and history is in your training, and it's not in your blood. And in sort of dealing with this mismatch, right, and sort of bringing in the kind of violence versus academic arguments, I think part of the answer here in terms of how we answer violence is that we don't. At a certain point, violence wins, okay? And I think most academics won't answer our Hindutva critics in kind. We're not gonna do ad hominem attacks just because they do. We're not gonna yell just because they do, right? I'm certainly not gonna be violent just because they are. But I do think that we can answer these things in other ways, using our strengths and then the sort of tools that we have been trained to use. So one thing that academics can do is to talk about this stuff. Okay, and the images you see here, these are from the anti-CAA protests in 2019. More recently, Another recent example would be the farmers' protests in northern India, and the recent spate of jailing climate activists, right? We shouldn't pretend that this stuff doesn't exist. And we certainly shouldn't treat it as mere impediments to our research, right? Oh, I just wish India would calm down so I could go back and do field work, right? No, I think that we should use our expertise and the platforms that we have been given in order to draw attention to a series of worsening situations in India from whatever vantage point or angle or sets of angles that your training has positioned you to do. For me, I made the decision to start doing this some time ago. And I leave it to others to judge the results thus far of that decision. But I will say this, in my own estimation, being involved in issues like this, in modern present day issues, has made me a better scholar. It's allowed me to be more engaged with public history, and it has also allowed me to see and articulate the impacts of my work and insights that I might be able to offer far beyond the ivory tower. One insight that I might be able to offer, and this is where I'll end my talk today, is with this. Hindutva ideologues dislike history, but they really need it. So they don't want to know about actual Indian history and all of its complexity. That's inconvenient or threatening, right? It can potentially even undermine their modern political stances, but they really need to invent their own mythology of the past, of sort of Hindu identity, and even the history of Hindu nationalism itself, okay? As a subject I didn't say much on today. And in a sense, does that not create inadvertently an opportunity for scholars? Because Hindu nationalists have primed a large audience to really care about the past while also keeping them ignorant of it. So might scholars like me come along and capitalize on some of that interest, right? And sort of shave off an audience for the real deal, for a nuanced look at specific parts of Indian history? I'm certainly going to keep trying. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for that rich talk. And we have allotted about another 35 minutes to 1:30 for some discussion. And I'm going to go ahead and voice some of the questions that have been coming in, but I would encourage anyone who hasn't asked a question and wants Professor Trushka to address another issue to please put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to it. Let me begin by just engaging you in a little conversation and give you a few questions of my own. So I was looking at the language of history, and in that book, you write of the need to take seriously alternatives to Western constructions of history, right? The need to make space for other kinds of historical consciousness. But at the same time, you lean on the authority of the Western Academy, its methods, its institutions. And so I'm thinking here of empiricism, peer reviews, university presses, to push back against Hindutva narratives of the past, for example, right? So can you reflect a little bit on this tension?
So essentially, at the end of the day, I decided that I don't see it as a tension. And it's not that I didn't have a moment where I did. I did when I was writing The Language of History. I had a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, if I write this, like, so like some Hindutva thinker is going to come along someday and actually bother to like read at least the introduction to the book and like use this against me. And so I sort of thought about that and I was like, but the problem is I believe it. I think that I think it's accurate. And I think that I can do both. And so I'm unwilling to take out the complexities of this, right? Just because it could be used against me, right? Like I'm not going to play the other side's game on this. And I think where I tried to sort of square the circle, and I don't know that I was fully successful, that's okay. But where I tried to square this circle in The Language of History is that while I want to admit the sort of historical nature of pre-modern Sanskrit materials, I want to do that. And I want to see what they thought history was. And I want to use that to put pressure on modern historians to think more seriously about the importance of narrative. I want to do all that, but I do not want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I'm not ready to give up on I don't know about empiricism. That's a very strong word.
Fair
But
enough.
not all views of the Indian past are equal. And I like to think of facticity, which is a dirty word for historians. I like to think of it as the sort of kind of range of certainty. Like we're more certain about some things about the past than others. And so for me, part of this came out in just sort of owning my own positionality. I am a modern historian. I'm not a pre-modern one, and I have no interest in being that. So that's sort of some of how I thought about that.
Yeah, interesting. So in a way, you might even say that your methods reflect your own historical consciousness, and you stand up for your kind of willingness to defend it and discuss it and disseminate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think sometimes people, even historians, like we like to pretend that that we're almost scientific. Some historians even think that they think that our methods are like actually scientific, and that we're sort of figuring out the past for all times, and that's just not true. And I don't see a problem with both admitting that and yet saying that, okay, not all views of the past are equal, and some things are more true than others, and you can't just change the outcomes of battles. Like you can't do that. So I don't think it has to be sort of all or nothing. And I think it's a whole lot more interesting when it's somewhat of a mixture.
Yeah. So let me drill down a little bit, since I myself am an Indologist and I work on Vedic texts and Sanskrit texts of various kinds. Your work definitely shines a light on many overlooked texts in Sanskrit that are nonetheless relevant to our historical understanding of early modern South Asia. And that's a major contribution you've made through your books and articles. And yet, so many Hindutva problems with the past, the Aryan migration theory being one problem they have, pertain to this deeper past, right? This deep pre-modernity, the Vedic, classical, and up to the early medieval periods. But the Sanskrit texts we might look to as witnesses for these periods, right? The Vedas, the epics, the Puranas are texts mostly about ritual, myth, legend. They are not, in other words, always amenable to Western ideas of history. And I know as well as anyone that there are exceptions to this. Michael Witzel's work, for example, on the history of early India mines the Vedas quite effectively to discuss the formation of the Kuru state. But if not in these classical texts, where should we look for pre-Mughal histories in Sanskrit, right? I mean, we have linguistic data that's helpful. We have art history and to a limited extent, archaeology. But I guess what I'm getting at is, to some extent, some of the deepest controversies and the most kind of pressing and fundamental ones in this discourse are ones that we sometimes lack the tools and sources to adjudicate effectively, based on the nature of some of the textual witnesses.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. And I think you're right. I mean, when we're talking about stuff, 3,000, 2,500 years ago, we have to read the text against the grain. We have to read them for purposes for which they were never intended, and get sorts of information out of them that they recorded basically incidentally, right? That was not the purpose of the original composers. I think things look very different by the time you get to even the first millennium CE, but certainly the second millennium CE. And I think we have abundant historical resources. And I write in the language of history, there's no genre. And I think that's been a problem. You know as well as I do, Sanskritists love categories and genres, and they love shastras of stuff. And there's no genre of history writing. There's no shastra of it in Sanskrit. And I think it survived in a whole lot of different genres. The sort of most popular one being poetry, like kavya, literature. And whereas today we would perceive a conflict there, right? You can have poetry that is historical, sort of in tone and nature, but you don't write history as poetry, right? That does not happen, but that's exactly how it happened, 800 years ago when Jayanaka wrote the Prithviraja Vijaya. It's a great poem, and it's also history. And that's part of what the book is designed to get at, is sort of, what did that mean for him? And what does that mean for us? And what tools we need in order to recover and get at it? I think the last thing that I'll comment on is this idea, because I agree with you that oftentimes people ask questions, especially about the deep past, that we lack the resources to answer fully. And I think that you do two things with that. You sort of answer to the best of your abilities and signal how uncertain you are about it. And
Mhm.
then you tell them to ask different questions, because
Mm.
there's an endless number of questions about the past, right? So, if you're not content to sort of buy into the Aryan migration theory because you don't think the evidence is strong enough, or you don't understand the strength of the linguistic evidence, well, like, look into something else, right? Like,
Mm.
there's a lot to study there.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, let me ask one or two questions before I kind of open it up to others that have come through. I'm kind of curious, just shifting gears to now. How have the politics of the pandemic affected these controversies about India's past? Have you seen any big changes in the last year in the tenor or substance of these debates?
That's a really interesting question. I can't say I've thought of it. Off the bat, I'm sure it's not incidental that I think many of the controversies, right, like the sort of the one last month about, the sort of restrictions on online academic events, so many of these controversies have been focused on social media, because that's
Mm.
how we're all communicating.
Yes.
To me, the big question is going to be, what does the sort of Indian academic scene look like when we all emerge from the pandemic and
Mm.
quarantine, and sort of how much is left there?
Hmm. Yeah, so I guess we'll see how that develops. Well, let me then choose some questions from the Q&A. First, I'll go to my colleague at Brown, Suvaid Yassin, who writes, "We know that the most glaring absence in the Hindutva version of history is either ignoring 1,000 years or so of Muslim presence and contributions, or when they do admit this, a kind of perspective that only otherizes Muslims. Could you speak to the argument that the real reason that Hindu nationalism arose was due to pressure by non-Brahmin movements for social justice, dignity reform, or dignity, reform, or of course, also the annihilation of caste, and thus Hinduism itself?" So what Suvi is getting at here is that the Hindu-Muslim tensions are kind of incidental to the kind of the fundamental struggle within this Hindutva discourse.
It's interesting. I would want to see more evidence, I suppose, on
Mm-hmm.
that point.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it has to be either or. I mean, Hindutva has many problems, but one thing I will not criticize it on is it is really complicated and complex, and it's not fully coherent. Like, I mean, any broad-based ideology is generally not. And so it's sort of being multi-sourced and having sort of different catalysts and motivations at specific times and places. I mean, to me, that's sort of part of the story. I do think that the perception of Hindu-Muslim tensions and the stokings of that, I do think that is a pretty strong storyline that does go back to 19th century historiography, and has, people have been fanning the flames of that specifically in the last couple of decades, right? But that does not mean that this other thing is not necessarily the case.
Right, so we have to hold both in mind. From Rajendra Bapat, who writes, wonders if you kind of witness any dynamics of the similar kind that we're discussing today with reference to Hindutva history in any other areas or studies of culture. So I think asking for parallels that you might see in this discourse around the world.
That's a great question. I don't know that I am the most qualified person to answer it. I am very focused on South Asia in terms of sort of what I do. I will say that when I teach this stuff to students, right, keep in mind I'm teaching in the United States context, so I do often use US examples. So a good example is, I think last week, the week before, I taught about the California textbook controversies, which there have been two of, regarding specifically how to present Indian or South Asian history, the term being one of the points of controversy. And there was one in 2005, one in 2016 and 2017. And as a way of introducing textbook controversies, I gave my students examples of sort of Civil War and sort of slavery-based textbook controversies in the United States. So, if the basic question is, do other societies have problems with history, especially problems that serve the dominant majority group? Absolutely. But in terms of a more specific comparison, I would not be the person to ask.
Okay, fair enough. But that inspires me to kind of add on. I mean, in the course of your career, have you, what would you say about the way these kind of Hindutva views of history have entered into identity politics in the Hindu diaspora? You know, for example, in the U.S., right? Following on the, the California textbooks would be kind of one such example. But do you see exponents of this ideology globally as strengthening it in significant ways back in India, for example?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think the sort of money trail there is pretty profound. And I should say, I mean, for me, the strength of Hindutva ideology among the Indian diaspora is not like in theory or esoteric. Like I teach and live in northern New Jersey, right? So like this is like very much part of my daily life. The majority of my students at Rutgers Newark are of South Asian descent. So, some of them, many of them have heard Hindutva stuff, even if not necessarily identifying its political valence, and have sort of grown up hearing certain things. And yeah, so that's something that I teach about actually quite a bit.
Yeah, and and again, just pushing a little further on this question, how do you address this kind of essentialist position that it's becoming very ascendant in identity politics, that somehow one has to belong to a culture, as if we could ever kind of essentialize a culture in that way, but that one has to belong to a culture or an ethnicity to address it or talk about it critically, or anything other than appreciatively, I would say?
So I guess I have multiple answers to that. One is that given that most of my work focuses on the pre-modern, right? Like show me an insider to Mughal culture, right? Like no, like trust me, I would be like first in line to get on that time machine and go back to Mughal India. But in the meantime, no one's an insider. I think obviously your sort of general point about, complexifying a single culture, like there's no insider to India. There's no insider to Hinduism. It's too diverse for that. I think that that's a very dangerous viewpoint. And I think you can see that in sort of where it originated, right? Like the idea that you have to belong to a group to speak about it, that's not something that necessarily goes back to sort of, minoritized groups. That's something that's been more often mobilized and used aggressively by a majority, right? And I think if you start thinking about majorities in the US and who's using that sort of rhetoric, I think it's something that most of us do not want anything to do with.
So a question from Ashish Jaja, and this brings us to an area I'm happy to kind of highlight. Adivasis, right, which is a Indian term for indigenous and tribal peoples of India, have lived in India before the Aryan invasion. They have never been Hindus. This is what the questioner says, and have their own animist religion. How can we bring their history up front and central to challenge toxic Hindutva politics? So I guess, pointing out that, raising this issue of indigeneity, actual indigeneity on some level, if I can maybe putting actual in scare quotes there, but different claims to indigeneity maybe is a way to talk about it.
Sure, absolutely. So one, I would add complexity to that, right? I mean, even in the oldest layers of the Rig Veda, there are non-Arya names, right? True. So I mean, there are groups, whether they were Dravidian speaking or Munda speaking or something else, right? I mean, there were non-Indo-European speakers that were integrated into that world early on. I think in terms of teaching, the answer is simply to teach it. I don't teach it anymore. I used to teach an overview of Indian religions, and I began with Adivasi traditions. I didn't begin with Hinduism and the Vedas. You begin at the beginning.
Right.
I think the last thing I would say is that, so a problem that people perceive that I think we should switch that and make it into a strength is as follows. Hinduism today has a sort of a strong narrative. Not all Hindus agree with it, but there is a narrative. It starts with the Vedas, and this goes back thousands of years and all this stuff. And Adivasi communities are plural, right? And they don't have texts going back. None of them, as far as I know, have texts going back thousands of years. And so it is not only a different history, it is a different kind of history with access to different kinds of resources. And I don't think we should necessarily, I don't know that sort of papering over that and just saying they're the oldest people in India, like that should be said, but maybe it's actually better to take the perceived weakness and make it a strength and say, maybe we should just focus on sort of different things in how we narrate this particular kind of religious history.
Very much. Yeah. Thanks for that. So let me just shift gears again. And, you addressed really vividly and in some ways troublingly the, the cost, I would say, to you of kind of sharing your work in the public sphere. And I think it's fair to say that unlike many academics who disseminate and defend their ideas at conferences and among colleagues, right, and in kind of specialized publications, but don't necessarily put much effort towards communication with the general public, you share your work widely, right, by writing as accessibly as possible. That's like a value that you hold, and by engaging your supporters and critics alike in various venues, most social media, most notably. So let me just ask, why is this important to you? How would you, can you make it, I mean, you've addressed this a little bit in your talk, but I assume you would urge your colleagues to follow the same paradigm, right, of kind of standing up and being counted, getting behind their work. So can you talk more about that?
So why do I do public facing work? And I hang out at specialist conferences too. Don't sell me short on specialist stuff.
Absolutely.
All right, but okay, why do I do it? So because it's part of the historian's calling, right? And even if you're not a historian, if you're an indologist or religious scholar, I mean, this is part of what it means to be an academic. And it's, to me, it's like any other part, right? The teaching, the service work, the specialist scholarship, you don't have to do all of it in equal proportion, and not everyone has to do all of it excellently, but someone's got to do the public facing work. And, I don't know that I'm like, in fact, I know I'm not the world's best at this, but like, I would like to think I have a decent writing style and I have something to say and I'm able to engage in public debates and so on and so forth. And so honestly, part of the reason is that it plays to some of my strengths. Another reason is that South Asian history is really, really hot and really relevant right now. That's not always the case. Like most of the time, no one cares what happened thousands of years ago, right? And like getting anyone to listen to historians, especially pre-modern historians, is like pulling teeth. And so how can I not capitalize on that moment? Right? It probably won't even last my entire career. Like how can I not use that to try to take some of the kind of politically fueled interest and turn it into real historical interests? And to my colleagues, I would say, like, you don't have to do it like me. There are millions of ways to be a public-facing academic. Like, choose and make your own path. It doesn't have to be mine. In fact, it shouldn't be mine. Like, do your own thing. But if I have a critical thing to say on this, it would be that I think many of us trained to be scholars of South Asia in a world where this is not what we envisioned. I mean, certainly through the end of my PhD, I had no idea that anyone beyond, low double digits of people would ever read most of my scholarship. I was not prepared for this. And I think many of us have sort of been caught unawares by the political attention to our work. And understand that, and understand that it can be uncomfortable, but like, try to seize the moment, because there is a lot of sort of virtue and goodness and then like positive things to be done with this, right? Use your strengths and try to do some of it.
Here's a question from someone who identifies himself as a student of computer science from Kolkata. And he writes, I've been an active participant in the anti-CAA and other anti-Hindutva protests, especially those opposing the military occupation of Kashmir. But sadly, the situation keeps worsening. Few scholars and writers like Arundhati Roy still keep on the war against this horror. What is your advice for activists in the field? Big question, I imagine.
So I wish I had really great advice, but I don't. And I want to be clear that that's not my situation. Right? I live and work in the United States. The only power that the Indian government has over me is a visa. That's it. That's very different than someone on the ground. So I mean, I don't know that it's appropriate for me to offer advice. What I can offer you is solidarity, and I can offer you a voice. And to a great degree, possibly even an increasing degree, that's a sort of direction I see my activism going, is enhancing the voices of people on the ground, and where necessary, sort of being able to say stuff that people within India, at least some people, can't say because they face repercussions on a level that is someone halfway around the world I do not face.
Now I have a question that comes from Ashutosh Varshni, a colleague at Brown and director of CCSA. He writes, Nehru's discovery of India is a secularist telling of Indian history. His heroes of Indian history are multi-religious, including Buddha, Ashoka, Akbar, Kabir, Nanak, and so on. His basic argument is that the composite Indian identity has been produced by an interaction of multiple religions, including, quite prominently, Indian Islam. But Nehru also says that Aurangzeb, quote, set the clock back, end quote, with his rule, creating deep religious cleavages. What is your reaction to this Nehru point?
Okay, so I'm glad you read the introduction to my Aurangzeb book, in which I cite that line. So I think Nehru was wrong. I mean, I think he was historically and factually wrong. More importantly, I mean, that's not that shocking, that I think somebody, writing 70 years ago, a politician was incorrect on this particular historical reading. But more important, and what I draw attention to in my Aurangzeb book is where he got that idea. Right? Nehru did not come up with that idea. He was working on the basis of colonial era scholarship and colonial era translations that were sort of partial and biased and designed explicitly to give a certain picture of Indo-Muslim rule. And I think that is a key point to understanding sort of anti-Muslim sentiments in popular Indian history, which exists far beyond Hindutva and the BJP. That's a much wider, more broad-based issue in modern South Asia. And part of the key to explaining how that happened is to understand that a sort of a negative view of India's Muslim rulers was perpetuated through what passed as scholarship in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. And many of those texts and translations are still in print and still used today.
Great, yeah. So we're running low on time, and I have to just thank them for their active submissions. There's a lot of some strongly worded contributions to this Q&A. But I'll just try to wrap this up with one or two questions that get at some of the sentiments that are being expressed here. So one for example is asking about the extent to which some of these some of the political movements that subscribe to Hindutva ideology are also, in the words of one questioner, perhaps a kind of vessel for other forces, neoliberal politics, militarism. How do we think about the complexity that you keep on talking about, right? And kind of and another way of putting this is, how do we deal with the category of religion in Hindutva ideology, right? Which kind of in its origins, with Savarkar at least, seems to kind of try to sidestep religion as the kind of primary category. So how do we both, give it the attention it deserves, right? But then also look past it to see, to understand the kind of other forces at play in this political discourse.
Yeah, I think that's really complicated. And if at least part of this question is coming from the fact that I very much focused on sort of cultural and religious aspects of Hindutva, that has to do, of course, with my own training, right? I don't analyze military stuff, generally speaking. But yeah, where does religion come in? So I mean, Savarkar, if he had a grave, would be rolling over in it, right? I mean, the man was an atheist, right? Openly and avowedly so, and that was part of the attraction of developing Hindutva for him, was to have some sort of unity that was not religious and not around Hindu practices and gods and that sort of stuff. But I think that Hindutva, like anything, it changes, right? And it has changed. I think that parts of its sort of core, its sort of founding identities have not shifted much in the last 100 years, but I think it actually has changed a lot on the issue of religion. And as I see it, many Hindutva ideologues want to make claims regarding Hinduism, and particularly they want to sort of narrow Hindu practices and traditions from a sort of very, very diverse, broad base to a very sort of narrow band of acceptable Hindu practices. And that's where you get, I think you can see that in some of the Hindutva anger at kind of bad Hindus. And that's a sort of rhetoric we see all the time, like, oh, you're not a real Hindu because X, Y, Z. So I think we are seeing that. We also see it sort of come out in this kind of martial Hinduism, right? But if you look at the imagery surrounding the Ram Mandir being constructed in Ayodhya, you see that. It's not the same devotional Ram. It's a very sort of like kind of like buff Ram in some of the images. All of that said, at the end of the day, Hindutva ideology remains a political ideology. And it may have claims or try to have claims on religion, but it is not Hinduism. And it's important to state that, and I state that over and over again, because this is a sort of false equivalence that is drawn, and then Hindutva ideologues use it to avoid criticism, right? It's easier to try to say, oh, you can't criticize us, we're a religion, rather than answer very powerful criticisms of your political views.
Absolutely. Yeah, so maybe I'll just pick one or two more questions here before we wrap that up. Just give me a second. There's a lot of interest in this topic for sure. And yeah, so I'm kind of interested in this question too, that's offered by Sajjad Hassan. And since we're talking about religion, we focus a lot on politicians, right? And you've just kind of reiterated that Hindutva is above all political ideology. But what role have you seen and do you see religious leaders playing in this discourse, right? Very visible people like Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, is kind of, a primary example of one way of kind of taking part in this discourse from the platform of religion, right? But can you reflect more on that?
So I was going to name Adityanath as well, and he's a great example because he's both, right? He's a religious leader and a political leader, and he may well be Prime Minister of India one day. Let's see where that all goes. I mean, I think there are a lot of intersections here. Where I guess an area where I am interested in sort of learning, honestly, and understanding a little bit more is on more local levels. Because the idea of these sort of religious leaders that exert this sort of large scale influence, arguably that's fairly innovative in the history of Hindu thought, right? I mean, arguably it's been a much more diffuse tradition over the centuries. And so to me, I think thinking about the kind of potential role of ethnography in uncovering some more local aspects of this. And I think there are scholars working on this, particularly in terms of how and why is Hindutva ideology spreading to areas like Kerala and Bengal, where it has historically not been so welcome.
Gotcha. Yeah, so maybe ethnography has something to contribute there in studies going forward. Okay, well, let me channel Ezra Klein here for my last question, because we have a student who writes, Dr. Troshkia, I'm currently a math major, but I've always been interested in South Asian history. Would you recommend any specific books or other reading material? And let me add my own gloss to that. As a teacher, I think what this is asking for is, in this kind of wild world of so many different claims, right, being advanced on behalf of India's historical narratives, what are the sources that you return to, time and again, that you admire and that you try to channel in your work?
So general advice, because it is really hard, right? It's really hard. All kinds of people are writing books and, putting out articles and, who do you trust? And I always counsel students, like, first you look at who this person is. And in doing that, you have to reflect a little bit on sort of what do you think are the important qualifications, right? So, if you want someone who is from India or of Indian descent, like, it's free world, feel free to do that. You are stepping outside of scholarly precepts, right? If you're going to institute some sort of ethnic or skin color bar, like you have walked away from the world of scholarship, and that's fine. You could do that, but be aware of what you're doing. I encourage people to think more about training, right? Do these people know relevant languages? Do they have relevant degrees or equivalents, right? If they did a more traditional model of education in South Asia. Is this peer review? Who published it? Think about why you should be listening to these sorts of individuals. In terms of people I return to again and again, I will give you two names, Richard Eaton and Ramila Topper. Okay, these are both pre-modern, right? So Ramila Topper, really much more ancient India. Her books are excellent, right? And if I'm 1/10 of the historian that she has been, my life will be a great success, professionally speaking. And one thing that I really like about Professor Topper, I like many things, but one thing I really like is that she doesn't shy away from the politics. She names it and she calmly discusses it again and again in many of her books. Second person, Richard Eaton, tends to work on the medieval period, medieval, early modern period. We have a lot of terminology problems there that I won't get into. In any case, sort of 1000 to 1800, and he's so generous. He's so giving in his writing and in his knowledge. He's both a great narrator and also very attached to sort of what is the evidence for this. Right, so he's both fun to read and also very compelling. I always walk away from his books sort of not only being able to, sort of summarize and re-articulate his arguments, but being able to say why. What's the backing for that? What's the evidence? So,
gotcha, great. Well, we're pretty much out of time. So, Audrey Trushka, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your work with us today at CCSA. And I want to really thank everyone who has tuned in and given us your attention and contributed to this conversation by contributing questions and comments. So Audrey, I wish you the best and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a good day.